You wake up on a Tuesday morning in Denver, Colorado, reach for your phone to check the news, and see a single headline that makes your blood run cold. Breaking, presidential emergency order, all housing in America now free, effective immediately. Your hands tremble as you scroll through hundreds of similar headlines flooding your screen. This isn't a gradual policy change. This isn't a housing reform program. This is the complete, instantaneous elimination of all housing costs in America, affecting every single property owner, renter, and homeless person in the country. Sarah Martinez, a 34-year-old single mother, stands frozen on her front porch in suburban Phoenix, staring at her phone screen. The notification keeps repeating itself as if her brain refuses to process the impossible words. Her monthly rent of $1,200, which consumed 40% of her income as a restaurant server, has just become zero. Forever. She stumbles inside, nearly dropping her coffee mug, where her 8-year-old son Miguel sits at the breakfast table eating cereal. "Mom, what's wrong?" "You look like you saw a ghost," Miguel asks, concern creeping into his young voice. "Miguel, honey," Sarah whispers, still processing the magnitude of what she's reading, "I think we don't have to pay rent anymore." "What does that mean?" Miguel questions innocently. Before Sarah can formulate an answer that makes sense to an 8-year-old, her phone explodes with calls from her landlord, her mother, her co-workers, her sister. She lets them all go to voicemail because she honestly has no idea what any of this means. 3,000 miles away in Manhattan, Richard Sterling, a 52-year-old real estate mogul worth $300 million, sits in his marble-floored penthouse living room watching 8 different news channels simultaneously on his wall-mounted screens. His face drains of color as reporters attempt to explain the unprecedented presidential declaration that has just turned his entire business empire into worthless paper. The president has announced that housing is now considered a basic human right, like water or air, and that no American will ever again pay rent, mortgage payments, or property taxes on residential properties. Richard's wife Catherine enters wearing her tennis outfit, racket in hand, completely unaware that their world has just collapsed. "Honey, are you ready for lunch at the club?" she asked cheerfully. Richard stares at her with hollow eyes and realizes he can't afford lunch at the club anymore because his real estate portfolio, which generated $20 million in annual rental income, now produces exactly $0. Forever. The television anchor's voice cuts through his shock. To repeat this breaking story, President Harrison has invoked emergency powers under the Housing Security Act to declare that all residential properties in America are now public utilities. No citizen will pay for housing. Period. We're receiving reports that this applies to everyone from penthouse owners to apartment renters to mobile home residents. Catherine drops her tennis racket. "What does that mean for us?" she asks, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard looks around their $20 million penthouse that they can no longer afford to maintain, furnish, or even heat, and realizes they are about to discover what it means to lose everything overnight. Across America, millions of landlords receive the same devastating news through emergency government notifications sent directly to their phones. Linda Foster has owned rental properties in Chicago for 23 years, carefully building a portfolio of 12 apartment units that provided her retirement income. She's sitting in her small office above her bakery when the alert arrives. "Attention property owners. Effective immediately, all residential rental income must cease. Tenants are no longer required to pay rent. Property taxes on residential real estate are suspended indefinitely. This is not a temporary measure." Linda reads the message 17 times before her brain accepts what it's saying. Her 12 rental units, which generated $8,000 monthly and secured her retirement at age 67, now produce zero income while still requiring maintenance, repairs, utilities for common areas, and property management. She has become responsible for housing 12 families at her own expense with no income to offset the costs. Her tenant Maria Santos has received the same notification but from the opposite perspective. Maria, a single mother working 2 jobs to afford her $800 monthly rent, stares at her phone in disbelief. After 6 years of choosing between groceries and rent payments, of working 16-hour days just to keep a roof over her 3 children's heads, she will never write another rent check. The apartment that consumed 60% of her income as a hotel housekeeper and evening janitor is now completely free. The immediate impact creates chaos that spreads across every level of American society within hours. Real estate offices become ghost towns as agents realize their profession has essentially vanished overnight. What do you sell when property has no price? How do you negotiate deals when there are no deals to negotiate? Mortgage companies face instant bankruptcy as homeowners realize they no longer need to make payments on properties they now own free and clear. Jennifer Walsh, a real estate agent in Seattle, arrives at her office to find pandemonium. Her colleagues are frantically calling clients, trying to understand what happens to pending sales contracts, listing agreements, and commission structures when real estate transactions become impossible. The $40 million in active listings she was managing have become meaningless numbers on meaningless paperwork. Her six-figure annual income from property sales has dropped to zero in a single morning. The banking sector experiences immediate crisis as mortgage departments realize their core business model has just been eliminated. Bank of America, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, and every other financial institution that profits from home loans watch trillions of dollars in mortgage assets become uncollectible overnight. David Thompson, a mortgage broker in Dallas who arranged $5 million in home loans monthly, sits in his office staring at loan applications that no longer serve any purpose. His phone rings constantly with confused borrowers asking the same questions. Do I still owe money on my mortgage? What happens to my credit score? Can the bank foreclose on a house that's legally free? David has no answers because the fundamental assumptions of mortgage lending have just been eliminated by presidential decree. At Wells Fargo headquarters in San Francisco, emergency board meetings convene as executives try to calculate losses that defy calculation. The bank's mortgage portfolio includes $800 billion in active home loans that borrowers are no longer legally required to repay. The mortgages still exist as financial instruments, but they're secured by properties that borrowers now own outright by government mandate. Chief Financial Officer Rebecca Chen faces the impossible task of explaining to shareholders how a profitable mortgage business worth hundreds of billions of dollars became worthless in a single morning. We're looking at the complete elimination of mortgage revenue across all residential lending, she tells the emergency board meeting. Our home loan division, which employed 12,000 people and generated $34 billion in annual revenue, has essentially ceased to exist. The ripple effects spread beyond financial institutions into every business that depends on housing costs for revenue. Moving companies face immediate crisis as people no longer need to relocate based on affordability. Why move from an expensive city to find cheaper housing when all housing is free? Property management companies watch their business model collapse as landlords can no longer afford to pay for services that generate no rental income. In Los Angeles, Mike Rodriguez runs a property management company that oversees 300 rental units. His business depended on collecting rent, managing tenant relationships, and maintaining properties for landlords who profited from rental income. When rent becomes illegal and property ownership becomes free, his services become unaffordable luxuries that landlords can't justify. His 23 employees who specialized in rent collection, lease negotiations, and tenant screening discover their skills have no market value in an economy where housing is free. Property management, like mortgage lending and real estate sales, becomes an obsolete profession overnight. The construction industry faces paradoxical challenges as demand for new housing explodes while financing for construction projects disappears completely. If housing is free, everyone wants better housing immediately. But if developers can't charge for completed homes, who will fund construction projects that cost millions of dollars to complete? Construction worker Tom Bradley, who has framed houses for 15 years, reports to a job site in suburban Houston only to learn that the development project has been canceled indefinitely. The builder, who had pre-sold 50 homes at an average price of $300,000 each, faces a $15 million loss if he completes construction of homes he can't sell. The developer, Patricia Wong, explains the impossible economics to her construction crews. I've invested $8 million in land acquisition, permits, and materials for this development. If I finish building these homes, I have to give them away for free. If I don't finish building them, I lose everything I've already invested and leave 50 families without the homes they were promised. Construction workers across America face immediate unemployment as developers cancel projects, halt new construction, and abandon half-completed buildings that can't generate revenue to justify completion costs. The construction industry, which employed 7 million Americans, experiences instant contraction as building becomes economically impossible. However, the human impact creates the most profound changes as American families realize their relationship with housing has fundamentally transformed overnight. For renters, the change brings immediate relief from the financial pressure that has defined their daily existence. Maria Santos, the housekeeper with 3 children, can finally afford groceries without choosing between food and shelter. Maria sits her children down at their kitchen table and tries to explain something she doesn't fully understand herself. Kids, she begins carefully, you know how mommy works 2 jobs to pay for our apartment? Her 12-year-old daughter Elena nods seriously. Well, the president just said that all homes in America are free now. We don't have to pay rent anymore. Ever. Elena's eyes widen with confusion and hope. Does that mean you don't have to work so much? She asked. Maria realizes she doesn't know the answer. If her housing is free, she could potentially work fewer hours and spend more time with her children. But the economic implications of free housing extend far beyond her individual situation. For homeowners with mortgages, the psychological impact proves complex and disorienting. Jennifer Murphy, a teacher in Denver who owes $180,000 on her home mortgage, discovers she now owns her house completely free. The mortgage payments that consumed 28% of her income for the past 7 years are simply eliminated by government decree. Jennifer calls her mortgage company to confirm what seems impossible. The customer service representative, following hastily written scripts for unprecedented situations, confirms that her mortgage balance is now zero and her monthly payments are permanently canceled. The house she thought would take 23 more years to pay off is now completely hers. But Jennifer realizes that financial freedom comes with unexpected complications. If everyone's housing becomes free, what happens to neighborhood property values? How do people decide where to live when cost is no longer a factor? What prevents everyone from moving to the most desirable areas when geography no longer correlates with affordability? The immediate migration patterns begin within hours as Americans realize they can live anywhere without financial consequences. Families start abandoning expensive urban areas for oceanfront properties, mountain retreats, and luxury neighborhoods that were previously beyond their economic reach. If a beachfront house in California costs the same as a studio apartment in Ohio, nothing, why not choose the beach? The social implications unfold rapidly as economic barriers to housing disappear and Americans discover what happens when geography becomes separated from individual financial capacity. Exclusive neighborhoods that maintain their character through high property costs suddenly become accessible to everyone, creating social tensions between longtime residents and newcomers who previously couldn't afford to live there. In Aspen, Colorado, longtime residents watch in shock as working-class families begin moving into multimillion-dollar homes that are now legally free. The exclusive ski town character, maintained for decades through astronomical housing costs that limited residents to the wealthy elite, transforms overnight as teachers, store clerks, and construction workers claim mansions previously reserved for billionaires. Local resident William Harrison, who paid $12 million for his mountain estate, watches a family of 6 move into the equally impressive home next door. The family patriarch works at a grocery store and makes $30,000 annually, but housing costs no longer prevent him from living in America's most exclusive zip code. The exclusive character of wealthy enclaves disappears as economic barriers to entry are eliminated by government mandate. Martha's Vineyard, the Hamptons, Beverly Hills, and similar prestigious areas become accessible to anyone willing to relocate, fundamentally altering their social composition and cultural identity. Business districts face immediate challenges as commercial real estate remains subject to market forces while residential properties become free. Office buildings, retail spaces, warehouses, and other commercial properties still require rent payments, but the companies and workers who lease these spaces have dramatically different economic circumstances when housing costs disappear. Restaurant owner Carlos Martinez discovers that his commercial rent remains $12,000 monthly while his residential rent becomes zero. His employees, who previously struggled to afford housing near the restaurant, can now live anywhere for free but still need wages to pay for food, transportation, and other necessities besides housing. Carlos realizes he could potentially pay his workers less since their housing costs have disappeared, but also recognizes that commercial rents, business expenses, and everything except residential housing continues operating under normal economic principles. The split between free housing and market-priced everything else creates economic complications no one anticipated. The employment implications prove far-reaching as industries related to housing costs experience immediate disruption while other sectors face labor shortages or surpluses based on workers' new freedom to live anywhere regardless of job location. Software engineers no longer need to live in expensive tech hubs like San Francisco or Seattle when housing costs don't vary by location. Technology worker Susan Chin, who paid $4,000 monthly for a studio apartment in San Francisco to work at a major tech company, realizes she can now live in a mansion in rural Montana while working remotely. Her job skills remain valuable and her salary unchanged, but her housing quality improves dramatically without any additional cost. The massive exodus from expensive urban areas begins immediately as workers realize they can maintain their high-paying jobs while dramatically improving their living situations by relocating to areas that were previously affordable only to local residents with lower incomes. Rural communities experience unprecedented population influx as urban professionals discover they can live in large homes with extensive property while maintaining their careers through remote work. Small towns that struggled with population decline and economic stagnation suddenly become destination communities for high-earning professionals seeking housing quality that urban areas cannot provide. The infrastructure implications become immediately apparent as communities designed for specific population densities experience rapid demographic changes that strain utilities, transportation, schools, and public services. Rural electric cooperatives that served 3,000 residents find themselves providing power to 15,000 new residents within months. School districts in previously rural areas face immediate overcrowding as families relocate from urban areas where schools were expensive or low quality to rural communities with good schools and free housing. Teachers, administrators, and support staff struggle to accommodate enrollment increases of 300% within single academic years. Healthcare systems in desirable areas experience similar pressures as patient populations explode beyond their capacity to provide services. Small hospitals that served local communities of 5,000 people find themselves responsible for healthcare delivery to 25,000 new residents who relocated for housing quality and lifestyle preferences. The environmental impact accelerates as Americans abandon dense urban housing for larger suburban and rural properties that require more resources per person for transportation, utilities, and infrastructure. The sprawl that urban planners spent decades trying to control through housing costs explodes when economic barriers to low-density living disappear. Energy consumption increases dramatically as families move from small urban apartments to large suburban homes with higher heating, cooling, and electrical demands. Transportation emissions rise as people choose housing locations based on personal preferences rather than proximity to employment, requiring longer commutes and more vehicle travel. The waste management, water treatment, and utility infrastructure in desirable areas becomes immediately overwhelmed as population distributions change faster than infrastructure can adapt. Systems designed for specific population densities cannot quickly adjust to serve dramatically different numbers of residents. The psychological and social adaptation proves complex as Americans adjust to housing abundance while other economic pressures remain unchanged. Families discover that free housing doesn't eliminate financial stress when healthcare, education, transportation, and consumer goods continue operating under market economics. Sarah Martinez, the single mother from Phoenix, realizes that eliminating her $1,200 monthly rent doesn't solve her financial problems when childcare costs $1,500 monthly and health insurance premiums consume another $600. Free housing improves her economic situation but doesn't eliminate the financial pressure of raising a child on a server's wage. The social status implications prove equally complex as Americans discover what happens to community identity when housing costs no longer create socioeconomic boundaries. Neighborhoods that develop distinct characters based on housing affordability become more diverse as economic barriers disappear. Children from different economic backgrounds attend the same schools and live in the same neighborhoods when housing costs no longer segregate communities by income level. The social dynamics of childhood friendships change when a surgeon's child and a grocery clerk's child live in equally impressive homes and attend identical schools. Dating and marriage patterns begin shifting as housing considerations disappear from relationship decisions. Young adults no longer need to consider their partner's financial capacity to afford housing, but other economic factors like career prospects, debt levels, and spending habits become more important for long-term compatibility. The crime patterns change dramatically as property theft becomes less motivated by housing desperation while other crimes adapt to new social conditions. Burglary focuses less on rent money and more on other financial pressures. Domestic violence potentially decreases in situations where housing insecurity contributed to family stress, but new tensions emerge around housing choices when couples disagree about relocation opportunities. Law enforcement agencies in desirable areas face immediate staffing challenges as populations explode beyond their capacity to provide public safety services. Police departments that served communities of 10,000 residents find themselves responsible for 50,000 people who relocated for housing quality and lifestyle preferences. The court systems experience similar pressures as legal disputes arise around housing transitions, property rights, and the intersection between free residential property and market-based commercial real estate. Judges struggle to interpret property law when residential ownership becomes free while commercial property remains subject to normal economic principles. Legal challenges emerge immediately as property owners, tenants, and government agencies contest the implementation and implications of free housing mandates. Real estate investors file lawsuits claiming government seizure of their rental income without compensation. Mortgage companies pursue legal action to recover loan balances that borrowers are no longer required to repay. The constitutional questions prove complex as legal scholars debate whether the government has authority to eliminate private property rights through executive action. Property ownership traditionally included the right to rent or sell real estate at market prices, but the free housing mandate eliminates these fundamental property rights without constitutional amendment or legislative approval. Local governments face immediate budget crises as property tax revenue from residential real estate disappears while public service demands increase from population redistributions. Municipalities that funded schools, police, fire departments, and infrastructure through residential property taxes find themselves unable to maintain basic services. City planners struggle to manage population distributions that change faster than infrastructure can adapt. Transportation systems designed for specific population densities become inadequate when residents redistribute based on housing preferences rather than employment locations and economic constraints. The international implications emerge as foreign governments and investors attempt to understand American housing policy that eliminates market mechanisms from residential real estate while maintaining them for all other economic sectors. International real estate investment in American residential properties stops completely when foreign investors realize they cannot generate returns from properties that Americans can occupy for free. Foreign citizens begin relocating to America in unprecedented numbers when they realize they can obtain free housing that costs thousands of dollars monthly in their home countries. Immigration patterns shift dramatically as housing costs, traditionally a barrier to American residents, disappear for anyone who can obtain legal residency. The global economic implications spread as American housing policy influences international real estate markets and challenges fundamental assumptions about property rights, market economics, and government authority over private property ownership. European governments face pressure from their citizens to implement similar free housing policies when they observe American families obtaining mansion-quality homes without cost while European families struggle with high housing expenses. The American experiment becomes a case study in radical housing policy that other nations consider adopting or rejecting based on observed outcomes. 1 year after housing became free in America, the social and economic transformation reveals both the remarkable human adaptability and the complex unintended consequences of eliminating market mechanisms from essential human needs while maintaining them for all other goods and services. The success stories demonstrate communities that organize effectively to manage population transitions, maintain infrastructure, and adapt public services to new demographic realities. Some areas achieve remarkable improvements in quality of life as families enjoy better housing while communities develop innovative approaches to funding public services without residential property tax revenue. Rural communities that embrace population growth create thriving economies as urban professionals bring valuable skills, diverse perspectives, and economic activity to previously declining areas. Small towns develop technology centers, educational programs, and cultural activities that enhance community life for both longtime residents and newcomers. The failure stories reveal communities overwhelmed by rapid population changes that strain infrastructure beyond capacity and create social tensions between established residents and newcomers with different expectations and cultural backgrounds. Some areas experience environmental degradation, traffic congestion, and public service failures that reduce quality of life for everyone. Urban areas that lose population to suburban and rural migration face economic decline as businesses close, tax revenues decrease, and infrastructure becomes underutilized. The concentration of employment opportunities in cities creates complicated commuting patterns when workers live in rural areas but travel to urban jobs. The economic implications prove mixed as eliminated housing costs improve household finances while creating challenges for industries dependent on housing-related revenue. Construction, real estate, mortgage lending, and property management experience severe contractions while other sectors adapt to workers' new flexibility in choosing housing locations. Innovation accelerates in some sectors as workers freed from housing cost constraints pursue entrepreneurship and creative projects that were previously impossible when rent and mortgage payments consumed large portions of their income. Small business development increases as people use money previously spent on housing for business investments and economic opportunities. However, the disruption to established economic patterns creates instability and uncertainty that affects business planning, investment decisions, and long-term economic growth. The separation between free housing and market-priced everything else creates economic complexities that challenge traditional models of resource allocation and economic coordination. The social transformation continues evolving as Americans adapt to communities where housing costs no longer determine neighborhood composition and social interactions develop across economic boundaries that previously created residential segregation. Children growing up in post-free housing America develop different relationships with property ownership, economic security, and community belonging when housing abundance eliminates one of the primary sources of family financial stress and social stratification. The political implications prove far-reaching as the success or failure of free housing influences electoral outcomes, policy debates, and fundamental questions about the role of government in providing essential human needs versus maintaining market-based resource allocation systems. As America approaches the second anniversary of free housing, the question becomes whether the benefits of eliminating housing costs outweigh the economic disruptions and social changes that result from separating one essential human need from market mechanisms while maintaining them for food, healthcare, education, and all other aspects of daily life. The experiment reveals that housing policy affects every aspect of American society from individual family finances to community development, economic systems, social relationships, environmental sustainability, and national economic competitiveness in ways that policymakers never fully anticipated when they decided to make housing free for everyone, forever. 2 years into America's free housing experiment, the transformation has created entirely new social structures and economic patterns that challenge fundamental assumptions about property ownership, community organization, and human behavior when essential needs are guaranteed rather than purchased through market transactions. The homeless population in America disappears almost overnight as every person gains legal access to residential property without payment requirements. Streets that were lined with tents and makeshift shelters become empty as former homeless individuals claim vacant apartments, houses, and other residential properties that owners can no longer afford to maintain without rental income. Marcus Washington, who lived on the streets of Los Angeles for 8 years after losing his construction job and apartment, walks into a luxury apartment building in Beverly Hills and informs the property manager that he is claiming Unit 412 as his new residence. The property manager, following federal guidelines hastily established for housing transitions, cannot legally deny him occupancy because the apartment is residential property and therefore free to any American citizen who claims it. Marcus spends his first night in the apartment sitting on the marble floor of the empty living room, staring out floor-to-ceiling windows at the city lights below. For 8 years he slept in doorways and under bridges. Now he lives in a $2 million apartment with panoramic views of the Pacific Ocean. The psychological adjustment from homelessness to luxury housing proves more challenging than he anticipated. The apartment has no furniture because the previous tenant, an entertainment industry executive who could no longer afford the monthly maintenance fees, moved out and sold everything to pay his debts. Marcus realizes that free housing doesn't include furniture, utilities, food, or any other necessities for daily living. He still needs income to survive, but now he has an address that doesn't disqualify him from employment opportunities. Similar stories unfold across America as the most vulnerable populations gain access to housing that was previously impossible for them to afford. The immediate elimination of homelessness represents the most visible success of the free housing policy, but the social integration challenges prove complex as communities adapt to residents with diverse backgrounds and life experiences. The luxury housing market experiences complete transformation as properties that cost millions of dollars to purchase now become available to anyone willing to claim them. Mansion owners who cannot afford property maintenance, utilities, and staff without rental income abandon estates that working-class families immediately occupy. The Rodriguez family, where both parents work at a grocery store and collectively earn $45,000 annually, move into a $12 million estate in Connecticut that was abandoned by a hedge fund manager who could no longer afford the $200,000 annual maintenance costs. The family discovers that living in a mansion requires skills and resources they never needed in their previous 2-bedroom apartment. The estate includes a swimming pool that requires weekly chemical treatment and seasonal maintenance. The landscaping covers 12 acres and needs professional care to prevent deterioration. The heating system costs $3,000 monthly during winter. The Rodriguez family quickly learns that free housing doesn't eliminate all housing-related expenses, and that some properties require significant ongoing investment to remain habitable. They organize with other working-class families who claim similar properties in the area, creating informal support networks where they share maintenance knowledge, pool resources for expensive repairs, and coordinate bulk purchasing of supplies needed for estate upkeep. Former mansion owners find themselves providing consultation to new residents who need guidance managing properties that require specialized knowledge and resources. The education system experiences profound transformation as school district boundaries become meaningless when families can relocate anywhere without housing cost considerations. Parents choose schools based on quality, programs, and philosophy rather than affordability and proximity to housing they can afford. Elite private schools face existential challenges as their exclusivity based on high tuition becomes less meaningful when families no longer spend significant income on housing. Some families who previously couldn't afford private school tuition because housing costs consumed most of their income can now redirect that money toward educational expenses. Public schools in desirable areas become overwhelmed as families relocate specifically to access high-quality educational opportunities that were previously limited to families who could afford expensive housing in those districts. School systems designed for specific enrollment numbers struggle to accommodate population increases of 200 to 300% within single academic years. The Palo Alto School District, renowned for academic excellence but previously accessible only to families who could afford Silicon Valley housing costs, experiences enrollment increases from 8,000 to 24,000 students within 18 months. The district attempts to maintain educational quality while serving triple their intended student population with the same physical facilities and teaching staff. Emergency classroom facilities are established in community centers, churches, and commercial buildings as school districts attempt to accommodate unprecedented enrollment growth. Teacher recruitment becomes critical as school districts compete for qualified educators in areas where student populations have exploded beyond capacity. Some teachers relocate specifically to serve communities that offer the best combination of free luxury housing and meaningful educational opportunities. Rural school districts that previously struggled to attract qualified teachers find themselves able to compete for talent when housing costs no longer create barriers to living in remote areas. The healthcare system faces similar challenges as patient populations redistribute based on housing preferences rather than proximity to medical facilities. Rural hospitals that served small local populations suddenly become responsible for providing care to large numbers of urban transplants who relocated for housing quality and lifestyle preferences. Dr. Amanda Foster runs a small clinic in rural Montana that served 3,000 residents before the free housing policy. Within 2 years, her patient population grows to 15,000 as urban professionals and their families relocate to the area for mountain views and outdoor recreation opportunities that are now accessible without premium housing costs. The clinic cannot handle the increased patient load with existing staff and facilities. Dr. Foster attempts to recruit additional physicians but discovers that medical professionals are distributed unevenly across regions as doctors also relocate based on housing and lifestyle preferences rather than community medical needs. Some rural areas develop excellent healthcare services as medical professionals choose to live and practice in scenic locations that were previously economically impractical. Other areas experience physician shortages as healthcare providers relocate to more desirable regions, leaving former patients without adequate medical services. The specialization in medical care becomes geographically concentrated as specialists choose locations based on personal preferences rather than patient distribution and community needs. Cardiologists, neurologists, and other specialists cluster in areas with attractive housing and lifestyle amenities, creating medical deserts in less desirable regions. Mental health services experience unique challenges as Americans process the psychological adjustment to radically different economic relationships with housing and community. Therapists report increasing demand for counseling related to housing transition stress, community integration challenges, and identity adjustment when housing costs no longer provide familiar structure for life planning and social relationships. The relationship counseling needs increase as couples disagree about housing choices when cost is no longer a constraining factor. Some partners want to relocate to luxury housing in scenic areas while others prefer to remain in familiar communities. Housing decisions that were previously constrained by financial reality become sources of relationship conflict when unlimited housing options create decision paralysis. Family therapy addresses challenges when extended family members claim housing in the same area, creating proximity that some family members find overwhelming. Adult children who moved away from parents for independence find their privacy compromised when parents relocate nearby specifically because housing costs no longer prevent them from living anywhere they choose. The dating and marriage patterns change significantly as housing considerations disappear from relationship decisions. Young adults no longer need partners who can contribute to rent or mortgage payments, but other compatibility factors become more important when couples must agree on housing locations and lifestyle choices without economic constraints. Social status markers evolve as housing no longer indicates economic success or social position. Neighborhood composition becomes more diverse as economic barriers disappear, creating communities where surgeons and janitors live in equally impressive homes and send their children to the same schools. The conspicuous consumption patterns shift as Americans cannot display wealth through expensive housing but redirect spending toward luxury goods, travel, vehicles, and experiences that still require payment. Designer clothing, expensive automobiles, and exclusive vacations become more important status indicators when housing costs disappear as markers of economic achievement. The luxury goods market expands as consumers redirect housing expenses toward other premium purchases. Jewelry, high-end electronics, fine dining, and luxury travel experience increase demand from families who previously spent large portions of their income on rent and mortgage payments. The automobile industry benefits significantly as consumers who no longer pay for housing redirect those funds toward vehicle purchases. Luxury car sales increase dramatically as families treat expensive automobiles as their primary display of economic success when housing no longer provides that function. The travel industry experiences unprecedented growth as Americans use money previously spent on housing costs for vacation travel and recreational experiences. International tourism, domestic travel, and adventure activities become accessible to middle-class families who previously couldn't afford such experiences due to housing expenses. The restaurant industry adapts to serve customers who have more discretionary income for dining experiences but may live in areas without established food service infrastructure. Rural areas that gain population from urban migration develop restaurant scenes to serve new residents accustomed to diverse dining options. The retail sector experiences geographic redistribution as shopping centers and commercial districts adapt to changed population patterns. Luxury retail outlets develop in rural areas that attract wealthy urban transplants, while urban commercial districts lose customers to suburban and rural migration patterns. The employment landscape transforms as workers gain flexibility to live anywhere regardless of job location, fundamentally altering labor markets and workplace relationships. Remote work becomes extremely popular as employees realize they can maintain urban salaries while living in scenic rural locations that offer superior housing quality at no cost. Technology companies that previously required employees to live in expensive urban areas like San Francisco, Seattle, and Boston lose their ability to attract talent through location-based compensation premiums. Workers no longer need higher salaries to afford housing in tech hubs when they can live anywhere for free and work remotely. The geographic distribution of high-paying jobs changes as companies realize they cannot attract or retain employees by offering salaries that compensate for expensive housing when housing becomes free everywhere. Salary structures adjust to reflect skills and productivity rather than location-based cost of living differences. Small towns that offer scenic beauty, outdoor recreation, and cultural amenities but previously lacked economic opportunities become popular destinations for remote workers who bring urban salaries to rural economies. These communities experience economic revitalization as high-earning professionals spend their income locally while living in previously affordable housing. The entrepreneurship patterns change as individuals use money previously spent on rent and mortgages to start businesses and pursue creative projects that were financially impossible when housing consumed large portions of their income. Small business development increases significantly in areas that attract relocated entrepreneurs seeking lifestyle improvements. Local businesses adapt to serve customers with different spending patterns and expectations. Rural communities that gain population from urban areas develop services and amenities to meet the demands of new residents accustomed to urban conveniences and willing to pay for premium services. The service sector grows in areas that attract affluent transplants who redirect their former housing expenses toward personal services like housekeeping, landscaping, personal training, and childcare. These service jobs provide employment opportunities for local residents while serving relocated professionals. The infrastructure challenges intensify as utilities, transportation, and public services struggle to adapt to population redistributions that occur faster than infrastructure development can accommodate. Electric utilities designed for specific service areas find themselves providing power to dramatically different customer distributions. Water treatment facilities experience capacity problems as communities designed for particular population densities serve 2 to 3 times their intended residents. Sewage systems require expansion and upgrade to handle increased usage from population growth in desirable areas. Transportation infrastructure becomes inadequate as road systems designed for rural traffic volumes handle suburban-level vehicle usage from transplanted professionals who maintain long-distance commutes to urban employment centers. Bridge, road, and highway systems require expansion that strains local government budgets already impacted by eliminated residential property tax revenue. The internet and telecommunications infrastructure requires rapid expansion as rural areas that previously had minimal connectivity needs suddenly serve technology workers and other professionals who require high-speed internet access for remote work. Telecommunications companies struggle to provide urban-level service to rural areas experiencing sudden population growth. The waste management systems become overwhelmed as rural waste collection and processing facilities designed for small populations handle waste volumes from much larger communities. Recycling programs and landfill capacity require expansion that local governments cannot easily fund without residential property tax revenue. The environmental impact accelerates as Americans abandon dense urban living for larger suburban and rural properties that require more resources per person for utilities, transportation, and infrastructure. Energy consumption increases as families move from small urban apartments to large suburban homes with higher heating, cooling, and electrical demands. Transportation emissions increase significantly as people choose housing locations based on personal preferences rather than proximity to employment, creating longer commutes and more vehicle travel. The environmental benefits of dense urban living disappear when housing costs no longer constrain location choices. Water consumption increases as families relocate from urban apartments to rural properties with landscaping, gardens, and outdoor amenities that require significant water resources. Rural water systems experience strain as usage patterns change from agricultural and small residential use to suburban-level consumption. Land use patterns shift toward lower-density development as families prefer larger properties with privacy and outdoor space when cost constraints disappear. The sprawl that urban planners spent decades controlling through housing costs accelerates when economic barriers to low-density living are eliminated. Natural habitat disruption increases as previously rural areas experience residential development to accommodate population growth from urban migration. Wildlife corridors become fragmented as suburban development expands into areas that were previously agricultural or natural land. The agricultural sector experiences complex changes as farmland values adjust to reflect only agricultural productivity rather than development potential, while rural communities gain population that creates new markets for local food production. Some farmers benefit from direct-to-consumer sales to relocated urban professionals who value local, organic, and specialty food products. Farm labor markets change as urban professionals relocating to rural areas sometimes pursue agricultural work as lifestyle choices rather than economic necessity. Hobby farming and small-scale agricultural production increase as people use land that becomes available when development pressure decreases on agricultural property. The food distribution systems adapt to serve changed population patterns as grocery stores and food service establishments develop in areas that gain population while closing in areas that lose residents to migration patterns. Rural areas that attract urban transplants develop food retail infrastructure to serve residents accustomed to diverse product selection and premium options. Local food systems develop as communities with new populations of urban transplants create demand for farmers' markets, organic produce, and specialty food products that support local agricultural production. The connection between food producers and consumers strengthens in areas where urban professionals relocate to rural communities. The cultural transformation continues evolving as communities adapt to residents with diverse backgrounds, expectations, and cultural preferences when housing costs no longer create homogeneous neighborhood populations. Rural communities experience cultural diversification as urban transplants bring different lifestyle preferences, political views, and social expectations. Arts and entertainment develop in areas that attract creative professionals who relocate for housing quality and lifestyle benefits while maintaining their artistic careers through remote work or direct sales. Rural communities gain cultural amenities as relocated artists, musicians, and writers create local cultural scenes. Community organizations adapt to serve diverse populations with different volunteer traditions, civic engagement patterns, and community involvement expectations. Local governments learn to balance the needs of longtime residents with the demands of newcomers who have different expectations for public services and community amenities. Religious communities experience membership changes as population redistributions affect local congregations while creating opportunities for new religious communities to develop in areas that gain diverse populations from urban migration patterns. The political implications prove significant as population redistributions affect electoral outcomes, policy priorities, and local government composition. Rural areas that gain population from urban migration experience political changes as new residents bring different voting patterns and policy preferences. Local elections become more competitive as newcomers participate in community governance and sometimes challenge established political relationships. Some rural communities welcome the civic engagement and fresh perspectives that new residents bring, while others experience tension between traditional community leadership and newer residents with different priorities. State-level politics change as population redistributions affect legislative district boundaries and electoral outcomes. States that gain population in rural areas may experience shifts in political representation that reflect changed demographic patterns resulting from free housing policies. Federal elections could be influenced by population redistributions if significant numbers of voters relocate from urban areas to rural regions with different political traditions and representation patterns. The long-term political consequences of free housing depend partly on whether population movements create lasting changes in regional political preferences. Policy debates at all government levels adapt to address challenges created by free housing implementation while considering proposals for extending similar approaches to other essential human needs like healthcare, education, and food security. As America approaches the third anniversary of free housing, communities continue adapting to economic and social transformations that challenge traditional relationships between property ownership, community membership, and individual economic security. The experiment demonstrates both remarkable human adaptability and the complex interconnections between housing policy and every aspect of social organization. The long-term sustainability of free housing depends on communities' ability to fund public services without residential property tax revenue, maintain infrastructure that serves changed population distributions, and preserve social cohesion when housing costs no longer create familiar community boundaries and shared economic experiences. The success of free housing as public policy ultimately depends on whether the benefits of eliminating housing insecurity outweigh the economic disruptions and social changes that result from separating one essential human need from market mechanisms while maintaining them for healthcare, education, food, and other necessities that continue requiring payment through traditional economic systems. America's free housing experiment reveals that housing policy affects human behavior, community development, economic systems, environmental sustainability, and social relationships in ways that extend far beyond the simple provision of shelter, creating transformations that continue evolving as individuals and communities adapt to economic abundance in housing combined with scarcity in other essential aspects of daily life. The generational impact becomes increasingly apparent as children who grow up in post-free housing America develop fundamentally different relationships with property ownership, economic security, and community belonging compared to their parents who experienced housing as a major financial burden and source of stress. 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez, who lived through the housing transition with her family, has no memory of her parents struggling to pay rent or worrying about eviction. For Emma, housing is simply available, like air or sunlight, and she cannot understand why her parents sometimes become emotional when discussing their apartment that was once a source of financial anxiety and is now simply their home. Emma's classmates include children from families that relocated from across the country, creating diverse classroom environments where economic background no longer correlates with housing quality or neighborhood composition. Her best friend Taylor's father is a surgeon while her other close friend Mason's mother works at a gas station. But all three families live in comparable homes because housing costs no longer create residential segregation by income level. The educational experiences for these children differ significantly from previous generations as school funding, district boundaries, and educational opportunities are no longer tied to housing affordability and neighborhood property values. Children receive education based on parental choices about school quality and philosophy rather than economic constraints that previously limited educational options to schools and neighborhoods families could afford. Teachers observe that children in post-free housing America demonstrate less anxiety about family economic security and show greater willingness to take creative risks in their learning when they don't absorb parental stress about housing costs. However, some children struggle with decision paralysis when families have unlimited housing options and frequently relocate based on lifestyle preferences rather than economic necessity. The teenage experience transforms as young people approach adulthood without the expectation that they will need to earn enough income to afford housing independently. 17-year-old Marcus Thompson plans to study art and poetry, career paths that his parents' generation often avoided due to concerns about earning enough to afford housing and basic living expenses. Marcus's parents initially worry about his career choices until they realize that their son will never face the housing insecurity that shaped their own career decisions. The elimination of housing costs provides young adults with freedom to pursue passions and interests that previous generations often sacrificed for financial security and stable housing. However, Some teenagers struggle with motivation and direction when housing security is guaranteed regardless of their academic achievement or career preparation. School counselors report increasing numbers of students who lack urgency about future planning because housing, the largest expense most adults face, is permanently provided without effort or achievement. The family formation patterns change significantly as young adults no longer need to delay marriage, partnership, or child-rearing due to housing affordability concerns. Couples can focus on emotional compatibility and life goals rather than combined income needed to afford appropriate housing for their relationship and potential family growth. The fertility rates increase in some communities as couples who previously delayed having children due to housing space and cost constraints realize they can relocate to larger homes whenever their family needs change. Parents can choose housing based on family size and children's needs rather than financial limitations that previously constrained family growth. Child-rearing approaches evolve as parents have more flexibility to choose neighborhoods, schools, and communities based on values and preferences rather than economic constraints. Children grow up in environments selected for educational quality, safety, and cultural amenities rather than housing affordability. Extended family relationships strengthen in some cases as grandparents, aunts, uncles, and adult siblings can choose to live near each other without economic barriers. Multi-generational support systems develop more naturally when families can relocate to the same areas for relationships rather than employment and housing cost considerations. The elderly population experiences varied impacts depending on their health, social connections, and adaptability to community changes. Some senior citizens benefit significantly from free housing that eliminates the financial stress of maintaining homes on fixed retirement incomes. Others feel displaced when their neighborhoods change character due to new residents with different backgrounds and expectations. Senior citizen Emma Walsh, 78 years old, has lived in her small Iowa town for 55 years and watched it transform from a declining agricultural community to a popular destination for urban retirees and remote workers seeking rural lifestyle benefits. Her neighborhood now includes families from California, New York, and Florida who relocated for housing quality and rural amenities. Emma appreciates the increased cultural activities, improved restaurants, and enhanced medical services that newcomers bring to her community. However, she struggles with social changes when longtime neighbors move away to pursue housing opportunities in other regions while new residents have different social expectations and community involvement patterns. The senior housing facilities experience significant disruption as elderly residents no longer need to choose housing based on affordability but can prioritize location, amenities, and care quality. Some seniors relocate from institutional care facilities to independent housing when cost is no longer a constraining factor for their housing decisions. Nursing homes and assisted living facilities face competition from family-based elder care as adult children can afford larger homes that accommodate aging parents without the financial burden that previously made institutional care more economical than family-based support systems. The disability community gains unprecedented housing access as individuals with disabilities can choose housing based on accessibility, support services, and community resources rather than affordability constraints that previously limited their housing options to whatever they could afford within their limited incomes. James Martinez, a 34-year-old man who uses a wheelchair due to a spinal cord injury, relocates from a barely accessible studio apartment to a fully accessible ranch home with wide doorways, roll-in showers, and ramp access to all areas. His previous housing was chosen based on affordable rent within his disability income rather than accessibility features that would have supported his independence and quality of life. The disability rights implications prove significant as free housing removes economic barriers that prevented individuals with disabilities from accessing housing that meets their specific needs for independence, safety, and community participation. Adaptive equipment, home modifications, and accessibility features become the primary considerations for housing choices rather than cost constraints. Mental health services in communities adapt to serve diverse populations with different cultural backgrounds, trauma histories, and treatment expectations as population redistributions create more heterogeneous communities. Rural areas that gain urban transplants develop mental health resources to serve residents accustomed to accessible psychiatric care and therapy services. Substance abuse treatment programs experience changes in demand patterns as economic stress related to housing costs decreases while other social pressures emerge from community transitions and identity adjustments when familiar social structures based on housing costs disappear. The criminal justice system adapts to changed crime patterns as property crimes motivated by housing desperation decrease while other criminal activities emerge related to resource disputes and social tensions in rapidly changing communities. Police departments in areas experiencing population growth struggle to maintain public safety with inadequate staffing for larger populations. Law enforcement agencies develop new approaches to community policing as neighborhood composition becomes more diverse and residents have different expectations for police services based on their previous community experiences. Rural police departments that served homogeneous agricultural communities learn to work with diverse populations that include urban professionals with different law enforcement expectations. The court systems handle increasing numbers of civil disputes related to property rights, housing transitions, and conflicts between longtime residents and newcomers with different community standards and expectations. Property law evolves to address situations where residential property rights are separated from commercial property rights and traditional ownership patterns. Legal education adapts as law schools develop new curricula addressing property rights in post-free housing legal frameworks, community mediation for diverse populations, and constitutional questions related to government authority over private property ownership and market mechanisms. The insurance industry experiences fundamental disruption as homeowners insurance, renters insurance, and property liability coverage adapt to situations where housing costs are eliminated but property maintenance and liability risks continue. Insurance companies develop new product offerings for property protection when ownership patterns and financial responsibilities change significantly. Homeowners insurance adapts to cover property maintenance and liability risks for residents who do not have traditional ownership investments in property upkeep and improvements. Insurance costs become more important considerations for housing choices when insurance premiums replace rent and mortgage payments as ongoing housing expenses. The banking industry continues adapting beyond the initial mortgage market collapse as financial institutions develop new service offerings for customers who no longer need housing loans but may have different saving, investment, and financial planning needs when housing costs disappear from household budgets. Credit scores and financial assessment criteria evolve as traditional indicators of financial responsibility based on rent and mortgage payment history become irrelevant for evaluating creditworthiness and financial stability. Banks develop new metrics for assessing loan risks when housing payment history is no longer available as a primary indicator of financial responsibility. Investment patterns change as individuals redirect money previously spent on housing costs toward retirement savings, education funding, business investments, and other financial goals that were previously difficult to pursue when housing consumed large portions of household income. The stock market experiences volatility as real estate investment trusts, construction companies, and housing-related industries adapt to dramatically changed market conditions while other sectors benefit from increased consumer spending in non-housing categories. Real estate investment strategies evolve as investors focus entirely on commercial properties, industrial real estate, and international markets since residential real estate investment becomes impossible when properties cannot generate rental income or appreciation profits. The international trade implications continue developing as foreign governments observe American free housing policies and consider whether similar approaches might benefit their own citizens while managing the economic disruptions that result from eliminating market mechanisms from essential human needs. Immigration patterns continue shifting as foreign citizens recognize that American residence provides access to free housing that costs significant portions of their income in their home countries. Immigration pressure increases as housing costs, traditionally a barrier to American residents, disappear for anyone who can obtain legal resident status. Foreign investment in American residential real estate stops completely as international investors realize they cannot generate returns from properties that Americans can occupy without payment. However, commercial real estate investment continues as foreign capital seeks returns from retail, office, industrial, and hospitality properties that remain subject to market forces. International economic relationships adapt as American housing policy influences global real estate markets and challenges traditional assumptions about property rights and market economics that underpin international trade agreements and investment frameworks. The tourism industry continues benefiting from increased domestic travel as Americans use money previously spent on housing costs for vacation travel and recreational experiences. International tourism to America increases as foreign visitors realize they can potentially access free accommodation if they can obtain temporary residential status. Travel patterns within America shift as domestic tourists choose destinations based on scenic beauty, cultural attractions, and recreational opportunities rather than accommodation costs that no longer vary by location. Tourist destinations that previously competed on affordable lodging develop new marketing strategies focused on experiences and amenities. The hospitality industry adapts as hotels, resorts, and other commercial accommodations compete with free residential housing that visitors can potentially access. Commercial lodging emphasizes services, amenities, and experiences that residential properties cannot provide while developing new pricing strategies that account for customers who no longer spend money on permanent housing. Restaurant and entertainment industries continue expanding as consumers redirect housing expenses toward dining experiences, entertainment, and recreational activities. Cultural venues, sports facilities, and entertainment districts develop in areas that gain population from migration patterns while closing in regions that lose residents to relocation opportunities. The technology sector continues adapting as software companies, internet services, and technology manufacturing adjust to workforce distributions that are no longer concentrated in expensive urban tech hubs. Technology innovation accelerates in some areas as workers use money previously spent on housing for equipment, education, and entrepreneurial ventures. Startup companies develop more easily as entrepreneurs use money previously spent on rent and mortgages for business investments and development costs. Venture capital patterns change as investors recognize that startup costs decrease when founders don't need high salaries to afford housing in expensive business centers. The manufacturing sector continues developing as communities that attract relocated professionals create demand for locally produced goods and services. Small-scale manufacturing becomes more viable as skilled workers relocate to areas with lower production costs while maintaining access to markets through internet commerce and transportation networks. Artisan production flourishes as creative professionals relocate to areas with attractive housing and lifestyle amenities while maintaining access to markets for handmade goods, custom products, and specialty items that benefit from direct producer-consumer relationships. The agricultural sector continues adapting as rural areas gain population that creates new markets for local food production while some agricultural land converts to residential use as former farmland becomes attractive for housing without premium costs for rural lifestyle benefits. Organic farming and specialty agriculture expand as relocated urban professionals create demand for high-quality local food products and are willing to pay premium prices for sustainable, locally produced food that supports environmental and health values. Community-supported agriculture programs grow as urban transplants in rural areas develop direct relationships with local farmers and participate in food production through volunteer labor, financial support, and community involvement in agricultural activities. The energy sector continues developing renewable energy resources as communities that gain population from relocation patterns invest in solar, wind, and other clean energy systems that provide energy independence and environmental benefits for growing populations. Energy consumption patterns evolve as Americans living in larger homes with more space require more heating, cooling, and electrical power while communities develop more sustainable energy systems to serve growing populations without proportional increases in environmental impact. Transportation infrastructure continues requiring expansion as population redistributions create new traffic patterns and transportation needs that existing systems cannot accommodate. Public transportation systems develop in rural areas that gain population density while urban systems adapt to decreased ridership from population migration. The environmental protection efforts adapt as communities balance population growth pressures with conservation goals and sustainable development practices. Land use planning becomes more important as development pressure increases in scenic and recreational areas that attract relocated residents. Water resource management becomes critical as population redistributions strain local water supplies and treatment systems beyond their designed capacity. Communities develop water conservation programs and infrastructure upgrades to serve larger populations while maintaining environmental sustainability. Waste management systems require expansion and improvement as rural areas that gain population must develop waste collection, recycling, and disposal systems adequate for larger communities while maintaining environmental protection standards. As America approaches the 4th anniversary of free housing, the transformation continues evolving as communities develop long-term strategies for managing population growth, funding public services, and maintaining social cohesion when traditional community boundaries based on housing costs no longer exist. The sustainability of free housing ultimately depends on communities' ability to create new forms of social organization, economic cooperation, and resource sharing that provide prosperity and security for diverse populations while maintaining environmental protection and quality of life for both longtime residents and newcomers. The Great American Housing Experiment demonstrates that fundamental changes to essential human needs create transformations that extend throughout society in ways that continue surprising both supporters and critics of policies that separate basic necessities from market mechanisms while maintaining traditional economic relationships for all other aspects of daily life and community development. The psychological research emerges showing that Americans who experience free housing report higher levels of life satisfaction and reduced anxiety compared to pre-policy measurements, but also demonstrate decreased motivation for career advancement and financial planning when housing security is guaranteed regardless of personal achievement or economic productivity. Mental health professionals document both positive outcomes from eliminated housing stress and concerning patterns of reduced personal responsibility when essential needs are provided without individual effort or contribution. The cultural preservation challenges intensify as historic neighborhoods and culturally significant communities experience rapid demographic changes when housing costs no longer maintain traditional population patterns. Some cultural landmarks and community traditions disappear when longtime residents relocate while newcomers bring different values and practices that transform established cultural identities. The innovation acceleration continues as Americans redirect creativity and resources previously focused on housing acquisition toward technological development, artistic expression, and entrepreneurial ventures. Patent applications increase by 40% as inventors and entrepreneurs use money previously spent on housing costs for research, development, and business creation. The social mobility patterns transform completely as children's educational and career opportunities are no longer constrained by family housing costs and neighborhood economic characteristics. Some families experience upward mobility through improved housing and educational access while others lose motivation for advancement when housing security is guaranteed regardless of achievement. The disaster response capabilities improve in some regions as communities with diverse populations and resources can better respond to emergencies and natural disasters when residents include people with varied skills and resources. However, some areas become more vulnerable when population growth exceeds infrastructure capacity for emergency services and disaster preparedness.